By one traditional count, the Gospels record about 35 parables told by Jesus, and for most of his public ministry, they weren't an occasional teaching device. Matthew's Gospel says flatly that he did not speak to the crowds without one. That alone is strange for a rabbi with an urgent message. Why choose again and again the one teaching method guaranteed to leave the majority of your audience confused? Stranger still is the reason Jesus himself gives, recorded in Mark's Gospel, when his own disciples ask him privately why he teaches this way. He doesn't say parables make things clearer. He says the opposite. To you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God, but for those outside, everything comes in parables, so that they may indeed see but not perceive. By some estimates, parables make up roughly a third of Jesus' recorded teaching in the first three Gospels, which makes the concealment problem harder to wave away, not easier. Most treatments of the parables skip past this verse entirely and go straight to the stories. This one doesn't. Start with the word itself. Parabole in Greek literally means something thrown alongside, a comparison set next to ordinary life to make an unfamiliar claim land through a familiar shape. Jesus wasn't inventing the form. Jewish teachers before and after him used mashal the same way. Proverb, riddle, extended comparison, a category broad enough to cover a one-line saying and a multi-scene story alike. A story built around a single vivid image also travels further in an oral culture than an abstract proposition does, and that's part of why these spread as fast as they did. But memorability alone doesn't explain the deliberate opacity Jesus names outright. What sets his use apart isn't the form, it's how rarely he explains it in public. Scholars typically sort the roughly 35 parables into four uneven clusters. Kingdom parables describe what God's reign is actually like against people's assumptions. Grace parables describe God's character toward those who've failed badly. Judgment parables describe a final accounting nobody gets to skip. And practical parables describe how to actually act this week if the first three are true. Luke's Gospel holds most of the grace material. Matthew holds most of the kingdom and judgment material. That distribution isn't an accident of source material. It reflects what each author was most concerned to make sure landed. The kingdom cluster opens with the one parable Jesus explains himself. The sower, scattering seed on path, rocky ground, thorns and good soil. 4 kinds of hearing, not 4 kinds of word. Because that explanation survives, in Matthew 13, it functions as a template for reading everything that follows. The mustard seed and the leaven make the same point twice, from different angles. God's reign starts absurdly small and works by growth and permeation, not by conquest. The hidden treasure and the pearl of great price make a harder point, that recognizing the kingdom's worth means selling everything else without regret, not negotiating a discount. And the wheat and the tares growing side by side until harvest on the owner's explicit order at a 5th. Mixed reality, good and bad coexisting in the same field, isn't a management failure to fix early. It's the deliberate condition until the ending arrives. Then comes the line most sermons quietly step around. Explaining why he teaches this way at all, Jesus tells his disciples plainly, in Mark 4, "To you the secret of God's kingdom has been given, but to those outside, everything is in parables," quoting Isaiah's ancient description of a people who look without seeing and listen without understanding. This isn't Jesus failing to communicate. It's Jesus deliberately invoking Isaiah 6, the prophet's own commissioning scene, where God warns him in advance that his preaching will harden a certain kind of listener rather than soften them, and applying that same warning to his own audience 8 centuries later. The form sorts its hearers rather than simply informing them. The grace cluster is where Luke concentrates his material, and the prodigal son carries the weight of the whole category. The detail worth sitting with is small and easy to miss. Seeing his son a long way off, the father runs. In the honor culture of first-century Judea, a patriarch running through the street was undignified, robes hiked up, in full public view, and the original audience would have felt that oddness immediately. Luke places 2 shorter parables right before it, the lost sheep and the lost coin, making the same point 3 times in one chapter. Whatever this God is like, the search itself is the point, not merely the reunion. 2 more parables in this cluster are engineered to offend a fairness instinct on purpose. In the laborers in the vineyard, workers hired at the 11th hour get paid the same as those who worked all day, and the landowner's answer to the complaint isn't an apology, it's a question. Are you envious because I am generous? In the unmerciful servant, a man forgiven an impossible debt, 10,000 talents, turns around and chokes a fellow servant over 100 denarii. Roughly a 500,000 to 1 ratio the original hearers would have caught instantly. The math isn't incidental. The math is the sermon. The judgment cluster refuses to let any of this stay comfortable. The 10 virgins and the talents both turn on a single hinge: readiness that can't be borrowed or improvised at the last minute. The rich fool builds bigger barns for a harvest he'll never live to see. This night, your soul is required of you. And the wedding feast adds a harder note still. The invited guests who make excuses are replaced by whoever can be found in the streets, and even inside that surprising invitation. One guest without a wedding garment is still put out, refusing the terms even after crossing the threshold. The sheep and the goats close Matthew's Gospel with a final separation whose stated criterion isn't correct doctrine, but how the vulnerable were actually treated. The least of these, my brothers. The practical cluster answers a different question. Given all of that, how does someone actually live this week? The Good Samaritan responds to a lawyer's attempt to define who legally counts as a neighbor by making the answer a member of a group his audience despised. The hero of the story is the outsider, not the priest or the Levite who pass by. The persistent widow and the friend at midnight, one right after the other in Luke, make the same argument about prayer. Not that God needs to be worn down, but that persistence itself is the posture of real trust. The tradition has read some of these very differently across the centuries, and it's worth being honest about the gap. Augustine read the Good Samaritan allegorically, point by point. The wounded man is Adam. The robbers are sin. The priest and Levite are the law's inability to save. The Samaritan is Christ. The inn is the church. That reading dominated for over 1,000 years. Modern scholarship, starting with Adolf Jülicher in the 19th century, pushed back hard, arguing each parable makes one central point and resists being decoded detail by detail. Both readings agree on what the story demands of the hearer. They disagree on how much of the story's furniture is meant to mean something on its own. There's older precedent for what parables are actually built to do, and it isn't found in Jesus' own teaching first. In 2 Samuel 12, the prophet Nathan tells King David a short story about a rich man who steals a poor man's only lamb, and David, furious, pronounces his own judgment before Nathan says 4 words that close the trap: "You are the man." That's the mechanism parables use throughout the Gospels, not illustration added after the point to make it clearer, but a story built to extract a verdict from the hearer before the hearer realizes the verdict lands on them. That mechanism is still exactly what a parable does to a reader now, 2,000 years removed from the original audience. Nobody can read The Prodigal Son and stay neutral. The story doesn't let you. It forces a location. Are you the younger son who finally comes home? The older son standing outside furious about fairness? Or the father who runs? The same forced location happens with the Good Samaritan. A reader has to decide, in real time, which of the 3 passers-by they'd actually have been on that road, not which one they'd like to imagine being. A sermon can tell you what to conclude. A parable hands you a mirror and waits. That's the practical answer to the puzzle this video opened with. Parables were never a failure to communicate clearly. Clarity was never the goal for every hearer equally. They were built to require something a lecture doesn't: a decision about whether to stay and ask what the story means, or walk away with a nice story about farming and forgiveness and nothing asked of you. 35 stories, unevenly split across 4 concerns: what the kingdom is like, what God is like toward failure, what the ending actually holds, and what to do about all of it this week. Mark's version of Jesus' own explanation ends with an uncomfortable promise, not a threat. To the one who has, more will be given. The parables were never trying to make it easy to walk away informed. They were built to make it hard to walk away neutral. Isaiah's old description of a people who see without perceiving was never really about the crowd 2,000 years ago. The line was always meant to double back and ask the question of whoever's still listening now.